Hi, everyone. This is Global Podcast, your window to the world. Breaking news, big ideas, your global hangout for what's happening now, and bold conversations. Wherever you are, we're bringing it to you. Let's get started.
Okay, let's unpack this. You've sent over a snapshot of, well, a really intense situation brewing on the India-Pakistan border.
Intense is definitely the word. Things escalated very quickly.
Yeah, we're looking at a series of rapid-fire events. There's this devastating terror attack acting as the initial spark.
Right.
Followed by significant military actions and, well, a sharp downturn in diplomatic relations.
A very sharp downturn.
Your sources lay out everything from renewed ceasefire violations all the way to, the international community calling for calm.
Which is standard, but the level of response varies.
True. So our mission in this deep dive is really to sift through all of this, pull out the crucial information you need to understand what's happening, why it matters.
And hopefully give you some genuine insights here.
Exactly, without getting lost in, a mountain of minor details.
What's immediately striking, I think, is just the sheer speed at which this whole crisis blew up.
Yeah.
It really underscores how volatile things are in that region, how just one act of violence can have these huge, far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely. And the event that seems to have really set everything in motion was that horrific terror attack in Pahalgam, April 22nd, 2025.
The details are grim.
Devastating toll, 26 civilians, mostly tourists, killed. I mean, that's just a stark reminder of the human cost here.
And according to the sources, it's one of the deadliest incidents in Kashmir in, recent years.
So following that attack, we saw a swift and pretty direct accusation from India.
Right, pointing the finger straight at Lashkar-e-Taiba, or Latay.
A militant group they believe operates out of Pakistan.
That accusation itself was like the first domino to fall in this whole chain reaction.
Right, and then Pakistan just as quickly denied any involvement.
Which is a fairly standard pattern in these situations, unfortunately.
Yeah, but regardless of the sort of he said, she said on the initial claims, the attack itself just created this environment that was just ripe for escalation.
Totally. It became the undeniable trigger for everything that followed.
So on the military front, what happened immediately after?
Well, the sources detail a pretty marked increase in ceasefire violations along the line of control, the Lost K.
Okay.
And what's notable is the consistency. It wasn't just one or two incidents. We're talking 6, then 7 consecutive nights where Pakistan Army posts reportedly initiated firing. Small arms fire, initially.
Consecutive nights. And was this localized or spread out?
It seems quite widespread. The report specifically mentions several key sectors. You've got Nowshera, Sindarbani, Akhnor, Kargwal, in the Jammu district.
Okay.
And then further north, Kupwara, Uri, and Baramulla. Poonch is also mentioned in the summaries.
So that suggests, it doesn't sound like isolated incidents. It sounds more like the deliberate, broad military response, perhaps.
It certainly points that way. And beyond just the frequency, there was also a concerning shift in the type of weaponry being used.
Oh, so?
The reports indicate it escalated. It went from that initial small arms fire to deploying heavier weaponry.
Like what?
Artillery, specifically mentioned in the Lipa Valley context.
Yeah.
That definitely signals a more, shall we say, aggressive posture.
Okay, so heavier weapons coming into play. And how did India react on the ground?
Their reaction, according to our sources, was described as swift and proportionate retaliation. Standard military language, but
Right.
They also emphasize a heightened state of alert all along the Lost Sea and the international border, the IB.
And there was that political move, too, wasn't there? The Indian Prime Minister granting complete operational freedom for retaliation.
Yes, that's a significant development.
What does that actually mean, operational freedom? What are the implications?
Well, that kind of authorization, it essentially gives the military commanders on the ground significant leeway. Much more freedom in how they respond.
Less red tape?
Potentially, yeah. It could remove bureaucratic hurdles, allow for a more robust, more immediate reaction to perceived threats or, provocations. It certainly signals a high level of seriousness from the top, from the Indian government.
And it wasn't just at the border, right? There were internal actions, too.
Correct.
Right.
We also saw a stepped-up effort in counterterrorism operations within Kashmir itself.
Like what?
Including reports of demolishing houses belonging to suspected terrorists in places like Shopian, Pulwama, and Kupwara.
Wow. So a two-pronged approach then, responding at the border and also intensifying internal security measures.
Exactly. And then perhaps more symbolically, there was the Indian Navy.
Yes, the anti-ship firing exercises in the Arabian Sea, that felt a bit different.
It did. It goes beyond a direct tit-for-tat on the Lost Sea, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like projecting a wider display of military strength, a signal, perhaps.
Absolutely. These kinds of naval exercises often serve multiple purposes. They obviously demonstrate maritime capabilities,
Sure.
but they can also be interpreted as a strategic signal to regional actors, maybe international ones too.
Yeah.
A show of force capability.
Okay, so connecting this back, military escalation like this often goes hand in hand with a breakdown in diplomacy, right?
Almost invariably. And that's exactly what the sources highlight here, a rapid diplomatic fallout.
India took some pretty significant steps, suspending the Indus Waters Treaty. That's huge.
That is a very big deal. That treaty has held, despite conflicts, for decades.
What are the potential long-term ramifications of suspending something like that? Governs water resources.
Crucial water resources, yeah.
Yeah.
Suspending a long-standing treaty like that, I mean, it has potentially massive long-term implications. It fosters huge mistrust.
Okay.
It could impact agriculture on both sides, potentially millions of people. And it just further strains already incredibly tense relations. It moves way beyond immediate security into fundamental resource management.
And that wasn't all. They also closed borders with Pakistan, expelled Pakistani diplomats.
Yeah, a whole raft of measures, each one carrying considerable weight on its own.
And Pakistan's response, did they just take it?
No, they didn't hesitate either. They retaliated pretty quickly. Suspended the Simla agreement.
Another foundational agreement.
Exactly. And closed its airspace and trade routes to India.
Yeah.
So you see this pretty comprehensive severing of diplomatic and, economic ties happening in a very short time frame.
Wow. So this rapid back and forth on the diplomatic front, it really just underscores how severe this crisis sparked by Pahalgam became.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about military actions anymore. The sort of fundamental relationship between the two countries took a massive hit very fast.
And India also went on a diplomatic offensive internationally.
They did actively engage the international community. Sources mentioned briefings for over 100 foreign diplomats in New Delhi.
100. That's quite an effort. What was the focus?
The focus, according to the sources, was really emphasizing Pakistan's alleged role in sponsoring terrorism, laying out their case.
What's the strategy behind such a broad diplomatic outreach like that?
Well, it's likely multifaceted. India would be aiming to build international consensus around its narrative.
Shape the story.
Exactly. Maybe isolate Pakistan a bit on the global stage, garner support or at least understanding for its actions. It's all about managing the international perception of the crisis.
Okay, but now, despite all this escalating action, all this tension, were there any attempts to pull back, to de-escalate?
There were, or at least the mechanisms were used. Our sources mentioned talks between the Directors General of Military Operations, the DGMOs.
Right over that dedicated hotline they have.
Precisely. For those unfamiliar, that DGMO hotline is, it's supposed to be a crucial direct communication channel between the top military commanders.
To manage border tensions, right. Prevent misunderstandings.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Facilitate de-escalation during crises. It's been used effectively in the past sometimes.
And yet, despite these DGMO talks happening,
the ceasefire violations reportedly continued.
That just really highlights how difficult it is to pull things back once tensions get this high, doesn't it? Especially with that level of deep-seated mistrust.
It really does. Even with established communication channels, the underlying issues, the momentum of the escalation, it can be incredibly hard to overcome.
Suggests maybe a disconnect between the talking and the actions on the ground.
Or just that the situation had gained too much momentum. It suggests that while they might be talking, the actions or intentions on the ground weren't aligning for whatever reason.
And then we get that glimpse of the sort of human cost beyond the initial attack. The report of an Indian BSF soldier being captured.
Yes, by Pakistan Rangers near the Firozapur border. Negotiations apparently underway for his release.
You can just imagine the added emotional weight and complexity that brings into an already charged situation.
Absolutely. These kinds of incidents involving personnel, captured soldiers, they can become huge points of contention. They really complicate diplomatic efforts further.
It's a very human face on it all.
It does. And they can really stir up public sentiment on both sides. And then adding to that, Pakistan claimed to have shot down 2 Indian military drones near the Lost Sea.
Right, so more military activity, more suspicion.
Exactly. It just underscores the heightened state of alert and the friction all along that line.
And India took another step too, didn't they? Closing airspace.
Yes. specifically closed its airspace to Pakistan Airlines and other Pakistan-registered aircraft, a punitive measure.
What kind of impact does an airspace closure like that actually have? Is it mostly symbolic?
It has both symbolic and practical consequences. Symbolically, yeah, it's a strong statement, a punitive measure.
Okay.
Practically, though, it disrupts air travel, potentially trade, depending on cargo flights, and it definitely impacts those people-to-people connections, making travel much harder.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit to the international reaction. The U.S. was quite vocal.
They were, urging both nations, quote, to de-escalate tensions. Standard diplomatic language again.
But they also specifically called for cooperation on the Pahalgam attack investigation. That seemed interesting.
It did. Why that particular emphasis, you think?
Well, maybe a desire for more clarity. Perhaps an independent assessment of what actually happened, who was responsible.
That makes sense. It could also indicate, perhaps, a U.S. willingness to play some kind of mediating role if both sides were actually open to it, which is a big if.
And their involvement went beyond just putting out statements, right? Secretary of State Marco Rubio got involved.
Yes, holding separate calls with both India's external affairs minister and Pakistan's prime minister. Direct, high-level engagement.
That level of direct calls from a major global power, that really emphasizes the international concern, doesn't it?
It certainly does. When you see Secretary of State level calls happening, it signifies that the international community, or really major players like the U.S., view the situation as a potential threat to regional stability, a serious one.
But the sources also added a bit of context there, didn't they, about global focus?
They did, noting that while, yes, there are these calls for restraint, other global powers are, quote, largely focused on other international crises.
What does that suggest to you about how high this specific situation is on the global priority list?
Well, it suggests that while it's definitely being monitored and there are concerns, it might not be the absolute top priority for many countries right now.
Because they're dealing with other major issues elsewhere.
Precisely, which could in turn limit the amount of direct intervention or concerted pressure from the broader international community. The bandwidth might just not be there.
What's really fascinating here, I think, is just seeing that interplay. How a localized, albeit horrific, act of terror can just cascade so rapidly into major military posturing, diplomatic breakdown. The work.
It really demonstrates the fragility, doesn't it? The fragility of peace, or even just a tense status quo in that region.
So here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. What we're seeing unfold here, it isn't just a series of isolated border skirmishes. Not at all.
No, it's a clear chain reaction.
Exactly. Sparked by that horrific violence, quickly leading to significant military and diplomatic repercussions on both sides. And all the while, the international community is watching, with varying degrees of engagement.
So you hopefully have a much clearer picture now of the sequence, the attack, the accusations flying back and forth.
The retaliatory military moves, the small arms escalating to artillery.
The diplomatic breakdown, the suspending treaties, closing airspace.
Right, and this ongoing, really tense situation, even with those DGMO talks happening in the background and international calls for calm.
So the big question then is, what does this all mean for the region's future? What are the potential paths forward from here?
Yeah, that's a question that obviously remains to be seen. It's still unfolding. But hopefully this deep dive has equipped you with a much more solid understanding of how we got to this point.
Which really raises an important question, maybe something for you to think about.
Yeah.
In such a volatile, complex geopolitical landscape,
Yeah.
what are the most effective strategies? How can nations actually prevent a single awful event like the Pahalgam attack from just spiraling completely out of control into a much broader regional crisis?
Right.
How do you effectively de-escalate when things get this bad?